2, 1. So that's all I have to say. Let me know when you're ready.
That's recorded.
Yeah. You've just broken the fourth wall, Jeff. Just double check the wording of the motions. To be clear, in case people who I just watched this is me showing what I would normally do in prep. I do not actually know the motion. Yeah. Okay, yeah. I know you've ideas, so I mean, I guess clashes. Like,
I think
quality music, better for artists.
I think op will run that these companies have more money, which is the prerequisite to do a bunch of that stuff.
Yeah.
I think the frame on go has to be that music, that these industries are highly profitable anyway for a bunch of reasons. They're how people enjoy art, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And then obviously they'll try to frame that out for everybody. But I think that it needs to even it as to why, given that that money, even if it exists more in op, goes less to the artist. And I think that's by proving that when it's just 3 companies dominating the art field in that way, they're likely to conclude massively such that they.
I think the important conclusion is to show it's like, because obviously if it's a once-off decision, it's just a prisoner's dilemma. To show that they're not stupid, they know that it's a repeated game.
And I think that means that on the money clash is symmetric, or that we are likely to get it. Then I think there's 2 other things. One is the number of artists. I think that on op side, even in the example from the emotion, I think it likely means that you focus on 1 or 2 or a set number of artists, and you want to get as much money as them as you can, which is like making sure you Taylor Swift or Beyonce, etc. But on our side, when there's more of those companies and more of that competition, you're more likely to see a plethora of different artists, where more people can enjoy those things. There's probably a word there around homogenization.
On homogenization, I think, because obviously the deadlock is like, it's the CEOs, the executives decide what music sounds like, versus on the other side, like, oh no, you have more money to go and diversify and get all the small artists. I think there's really interesting stuff we could do to try to break this deadlock, around how the normal people engaging in music changed. So how just the huge labels pushing certain faces continually, versus a bunch of small labels all going differently, plus the increase in advertising meant that people used to search out music, try different things. Now they just receive passively, and how that's the thing which has enabled homogenization.
I also think it's just like creating like not generic music, but music that appeals to the masses, because the level of profitability that you often demand means that it's more difficult to kind of niches and op.
Other interesting stuff on op which they can do is there's a like bullshit. You characterize this as like some labels were collapsing, they were bought out to stop collapse, they were then put within it and allowed those sub niches to stay alive.
Which means the profitability anyway beats that, because it explains why.
So we needed profitability anyway, and then say these just had so much more profit and then just bought people out. But secondly, I think for diversification of art and smaller studios, there's an interesting you can do an op if you know how like in like football, right, like sports fans will have things of like, oh, PSG buys from a smaller club who's produced those. So like small artists get signed to a small label, their contract gets bought out, which then gives that smaller label the capacity they need to find more people. I think that's a good op point as well. Which one of our cases beats that? Probably like the long run norm stuff would kind of beat that, but still not fully. But we can always trade it off.
So the end point of that on op then is they have more money to do stuff that we beat that, or at least watched it ideally. And the second layer is that on op you might have more smaller artists and minority artists, but we can beat that by saying that these are more they exist more frequently anyway because
Yeah.
you have a bunch more
Yeah,
labels.
if we have sufficient profitability for the smaller
Yeah,
studios,
okay.
and in fact they have the profitability because of the domination of the market of the big
Yeah.
faces. Okay, okay.
Right. Is there anything else about that is like independent of those clashes that we could lose?
I think everything's probably downstream, like the pastors going through stores and stuff, right?
Yeah, I think that the big thing that will carry us on will be because this debate isn't about monopolization, but more so just the oligopoly. It's like
Yeah.
the amount of
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Cool. So then, on profitability anyway, why is this the case? I think it's just that people use this as a big part of their what's the word? Like pastimes.
Yeah, pastimes. So there's huge demand for music.
The second is just that there's often just advertisers. So you watch a YouTube video, you go to Spotify.
Yeah.
People pay to do that.
So obviously they're going to have the advertising consolidated now is the harm.
Yeah. And then you have merchandise.
Yeah, merchandise. Tours are like marginally profitable, but like even small people can just do like small gigs in places in their own town and do a residency if they need to be while they're recording.
Is that chronic? I think substantially first. And then
you can do E on long run. This is more a cost thing, but like the like democratization of equipment and stuff.
Yeah.
Like,
so I think how Apple push back here is to say that the cost will actually. So even if it is profitable, the initial costs are high. The point of entry is difficult. But I think we kind of need to beat this in a way. I think the first is that you just have like the thing you say where it's like democratized, where you have YouTube, you have TikTok, etc.
Also, this is retrospective, so we should do some other stuff.
Yeah. No, I agree.
I think there's some, again, interesting academic around like the reason why there's a high expectation of huge costs was studios created a huge emphasis on like perfect sound quality and all these kinds of things, which still exists to an extent, but more folky stuff and more like rough sounding things or like garage produced things
I think
be seen as viable.
I think the easier way to prove that is just to say that it's just a microphone. It might just be you go to the speaker.
But this is bullshit. We do the Ooga Booga.
No, but then the other thing is that you might have someone renting out a studio to like 4 record labels.
Yeah.
And you come in on a Monday, you do your artists, and they come in on a Tuesday.
Yeah. There also is government residency programs which exist for studios, and that likely would have had more.
Government funding. Profitability.
Yeah, government funding. Yeah. So that covers.
Actually, I'll put that in cost rather than profit.
To be fair, my interesting back there as well does feed into like less jobs for technicians, and there are less technicians. So. Avoiding having to make that trade-off.
But also, the other thing is that investors are speculative, which is to say that to some extent that even if the initial costs are high, they're willing to speculate that in the future you might get the free.
Because there can be huge blow-ups in the industry,
Yeah.
Almost then, so harm to sort of control over industry then, I guess. It's just not the one main point you're running, and then like the impacts coming out of it.
Out of profitability anyway, cost, and then what was the thing you just said there?
We're not doing also like the huge like oligopoly control basically. And then from that how it fucks artists, fucks
so I think number of artists is key here.
Number of
because that's the underlying logic of both sides. Like whether you've marginally more money or marginally more artists, that means that
obviously you're speaking for it's your preference. I think that flows out of some of the oligopoly stuff.
So what do you envision the oligopoly stuff to be?
Your stuff on like
the collusion, sorry.
Yeah, collusion.
So I agree.
Yeah. This is not a prisoner's dilemma because it's an iterative game.
The first is so what are the reasons in which they would conclude?
Well, so if you so the only reason why you would compete is because you're the person's undercut you, so you want first mover advantage. But that only makes sense if it's a once-off decision, right? So why would I undercut someone if I know that they're going to undercut me back?
It's race to the bottom.
Yeah, race to the bottom. And crucially, when you have 3 people who are able to set the broad industry price because they control a significant market share, they then are people who know that the other group knows this. They don't even need to say it to each other. They're just like not stupid.
And obviously we need to prove that you don't conclude when there's 15.
Yeah, and I think the lack of competition back and forth also silently signals to each other.
And then I also say that they actually have like some degree of interaction that's implicit, right? It's not like let's conclude and rate the market because it's legal, but it's like maybe you do let an artist sign from your record label to theirs, but you say, okay, but we'll give you a deal or pay you out or something. So you always to some extent have to talk with them or negotiate it.
And I think that's what kind of just from, like, obviously it's illegal, but they're all friends.
Yeah.
Like, they work in the same industry.
But it's just like they go to concerts, award shows, they might have gone to like...
And they discuss how their company runs a certain policy, and they happen to sit in a room where the other company has
But it's also, they set broader prices, which means it's mutually beneficial.
Yeah.
Because the level of profitability you derive from maintaining that is bigger than the potential revenue you get from competing.
Yeah. Especially after a long while.
Okay, so then given that they're likely to conclude in that way, what does that mean?
So I think this means maybe some capacity stuff you want to do as well?
So I think the impacts here, sorry, the impacts here are, oh wait, I also forgot the even on profitability.
Yeah. I think capacity to dominate the market and shut out like indie smaller people is useful. But I think you just do that by like rather pattern.
So on conclusion, the impacts then become the first is you get
high prices, accessible.
You get less artists. Fucking what's the word? Sorry for the cursing.
Also like 20 times.
Less. What's the word I'm looking for?
I don't know. You're looking for it.
So true.
Being hired, collaborating.
Oh, less pay.
Less pay.
Worse.
Oh yeah. Bad conditions. Yeah.
Now, I'll obviously say that they have incentives to do so.
Yeah. I think then huge advertising shutting out other people.
Yeah. Yeah. So that even if there's other smaller things that exist,
they're shut out by the advertising.
Okay. Then I think I need to write out the notes on specifically less artists.
Yeah. The US artist, and I think I'll do some of that norm stuff probably. I don't know whether I'll do it as development or.
Do we have another minute or two?
Yeah.
So.
You're just the one right.
Yeah.
So I'll stay in the frame while you write.
So I think so why do you get less artists? I think the first is that means you conclude to not over-compete. So that. And then I think the second becomes that you want to actually protect the certainty of the asset, which is that like there's always some risk in whether your artist might be profitable or go mainstream, and which means that if you have one that is successful, that has the fan base that's loyal, why would you then force them to compete and have someone that could replace them?
Yeah.
Then there is some stuff about how music is homogenized and what that looks like. Obviously, that to some extent that can be impacted.
I can do that. I don't know stuff.
Yeah, and then I think you can extend that indefinitely.
Yeah.
And protect this fucking mainstream trends, musician, but also.
So you can do like if more people control the market, like just certain executives have certain things that they like to hear, and they don't make decisions. You do less people making decisions, you get less.
Okay, and why does this not happen on the part?
Probably that. I mean, like every studio needs a certain amount of huge cash cows, right? More studios means you need more cash cows.
The second is that there's just less collusion.
Yeah.
The third is that like literally if there are 3 artists per company and they have 3 companies and we have 20 companies.
Doing the maths on the first mech for the third mech. Scammer.
I think we're doing that.
Yeah, that's good.
Three things from opening government. One, framing out the vast majority of uniqueness that I think applies to having an oligopolistic market around profitability, around costings, and around the ability to actually allow that to function. Secondly, on why they often collude in very malicious ways, but even if they do not, the simple existence of that market means that competition is stifled. And thirdly, why you get less artists, which is the underlying logic of all of their impacts, and each individual artist hired ultimately means you have more to what they want.
One, on why it's profitable. I think this is in 4 ways. The first is the vast majority of people often spend their past times listening to music. When you go on walks, you often listen to songs. When you have certain memories, you attach them to those types of things. So you often follow artists, you look at their personal lives, you often follow them on social media and see them in a deep way, which means you're able to weaponize and profitize that. The second is advertising, which is to say that when you have a musician on Spotify, on YouTube, on TikTok, they're able to do things like sell advertising space, or the record label that they exist with means that people want to see the most amount of eyeballs. Think about it, the vast majority of people on websites and companies like TikTok and the status quo are able to leverage that, even if they're non-musicians, by the simple fact that having a video that's like 1 minute in length of a certain song means that you get monetized. The third is merchandise. As you build up your fan base, you can charge 10, 20, 40, 50 pounds for certain things like t-shirts, memorabilia, etc., which often means that you then have more incentives to be able to push that. Those individuals often want to show that the signs of being a super fan. They get things like invited backstage, they get things like advertised and tickets, etc., and on tours and tickets. Therefore, I think on either side, regardless of whether it's a 70% market, regardless of whether it's a bunch of smaller independent areas, you are likely to see high degrees of profitability in that area. Now, opposition might push back here and say, there's initial costs, you have to run concerts, you have to produce that merchandise. I would say 4 things on this. The first is that YouTube and TikTok, etc., given what I've said, is very low barrier to entry. Maybe even before YouTube, you things like SoundCloud, where you just had the ability to make those music, or even before that, you just burned a CD and passed around your local area, and things like that spread around. Look at the rise of Eminem, Drake, and Snoop Dogg in the 90s, meaning that you're able to get that at a very, very low cost. 2, you're able to share those records with your friends. You get 10 people sharing to 10 people. The math expands on and on and on. Thirdly, government often funds this to art programs, etc., to ensure that artists are there so that individuals are happy and can see that those things are being funded. There's often some degree of political pressure to ensure that that level is there. So even if the cost is higher, government in response will either have to subsidize that higher, but as more companies get profitable, they therefore require or are eligible for that. The fourth is investors speculate, which is to say that they're likely to see, given all of the prior mechanisms, that there is potential future profit. Even if only half of them are profitable, they might diversify that type of investment portfolio such that they invest in a multitude of them, meaning that they are likely to invest and therefore give you the capital to set up all of those costs, even if the first bit of that framing doesn't exist. Given all of that, I think that means you have the same level of capital, you have the same level of resources to be able to hire people to produce their content, etc. Given this, argument number 1 on collusion. There's 4 ways in which they are likely to collude. The first is in natural economics, you often compete preemptively because you want the first mover's advantage because you believe they can't retaliate in response. The problem is, if I undercut opening opposition, then their incentive is to immediately retaliate and undercut me. But what I would say is, where you do not do that, you're more likely to perceive this as saying, we don't want to actively compete and lower the degree of bottom profit line in this area. The second is that you can set a broader price because the relative benefit of profit gained from competition is lower than the profit gained from not competing, because you can always continue to expand that degree of profitability. Think about it. If my profit is $5 and I could gain $1.50 by undercutting OO, but now mine goes down to $1.50, that's €2 or $2 less in profit overall. The third is that these individuals often just specifically are likely to implicitly negotiate with them about this. The fact is that maybe you let one artist go from one oligopolistic power to another, which means that degree of negotiation means that you often implicitly can conclude and say, you take this one, we'll get the next one, and therefore that relationship builds. But fourthly, they're often friends. They often exist in these types of areas. They go to concerts together, award shows, companies, they vote on awards for music, etc. What are the implications of this? The first is that I think generally you just often get less pay and wage conditions because you can no longer position these individuals against each other because specifically they have lower leverage and lower alternatives. On the other side of the debate, you have things like the fact that there's just way too many people for you able to build that relationship. The second is that you're always skeptical of the fact that there are so many people in so many different boardrooms, e.g. 30, 40 different music labels, that means that you always have to preemptively respond. But it's free, it's contained, you know the behavior, you know the people, and you therefore do that. The second is on advertising. These are likely to shut down competition and prevent new entrants, given that the cost of entry then becomes so high that you can't overcome that. Even if they have more money, even if they can prove that, I would say this means 2 things. 1, this money often doesn't get trickled down to the artist or the average person. because the average person does not have the capacity to be able to find those alternatives, so they do not have to give them that extra capital, or on the comparative, they may have some.
The problem with the race to the bottom mechanism is that there's always a first mover advantage for the first actor that undercuts, which means that regardless of the quantity of actors, there is always a structural risk in colluding, which by collusion will not happen.
No, because there's the first mover advantage, and the second, and the third, and the fourth, and it just continues to go down. The third argument, there's less artists. Why is there less? All the conclusion mechanisms means that you have incentives not to continuously hire more artists, so that you have more leverage. You can see that this is a good thing that you want to do. But secondarily, you want to protect that asset that has succeeded. You see this one artist or two or three artists that are profitable, that you see them as being mainstream, that they've gotten that degree of market access and that market penetration. That means that you are likely to threaten the position by continuously giving the resources or giving that type of public messaging and level of concert and support on their side, specifically meaning that you often want to ensure that you can maintain that asset. But thirdly, I would say there's certain biases where you choose to appeal to the individual at the top of that 1 to 3 companies as opposed to those plethora of those companies. What does this mean? I think on the comparative, you have more studios where specifically you just have more cash flows. So even if those mechanisms asymmetrically apply, the people that they apply to are greater in number, so the outcome on that is also greater. The second is you just have less capacity to conclude, and thirdly, even if it's 3 artists per recording studio, that is now increased to 20 studios per person. What does this mean? I just think you get less artists, less people trying to break in, less people producing that art, which means that 1, people consume are less able to find the art that recognizes them. 2, you have less artists less able to do that. So even if things are marginally better on their side, they're marginally better for 100 people, where on our side they might be marginally worse, but for 200 people, which is a massive aesthetic.
The problem when opening government decides to spend 6 minutes preempting a potential OO they are afraid of is they practically have no benefits. The only thing Jack says in terms of comparative is less artists. If we're able to prove that not only we have more artists, but also there are better conditions for those artists, we win on 2 different metrics. But the first thing I want to address before that is the metric on collusion versus competition, because that is one of the mechanisms that opening government pretends they have a comparative on. Why do we still have competition on our side, and why doesn't collusion happen? Even if they collude in certain areas of their operations, they do not collude in the most important area to the opening government case, which is competition for the artists themselves. You want to capture the most relevant artists, the most up-and-coming artists, because they are the ones that you bring up your brand on and build up your brand on. But also note that the music industry is incredibly speculative, which is to say music is built on trends. The entire Brat thing, I haven't heard about that artist a year ago, and I don't think most people have, because they were not particularly relevant at that point. The analysis of that at this point then is that you don't know in which way people's interest will shift. You do not know what TikTok trend is going to happen or what YouTube trend is going to happen, as per OG's own mechanism of how the barrier to entry is low. This combined with the fact that the market is not factually a monopoly, there is still a 30% of the industry outside of these 3 companies. These 3 companies also compete. The artists can be independent as per OG's own mech of the low barrier to entry to independent platforms. This means you are at a consistent risk of either new competition coming up or you losing to your competition, which means you compete for artists, which means you produce more of them and grant them better conditions. But secondly, Jack doesn't really respond to my POI. The way in which the first mover advantage works is if you are the first actor to undercut, there is a time lag until the second actor undercuts you, which is the same time lag in which you capture certain shares of the market, insofar as they never prove the market is monopolistic enough for this to not be relevant to those actors. That is a reason why collusion is structurally risky, because there's always a moral hazard involved in collusion. But secondly, there are external mechanisms that ensure competition, because these companies are publicly traded, which is to say that they're accountable to their shareholders. The way this works in most competitive industries is that shareholders determine the success of the business plan of the company, not only on whether it has a profit margin in a vacuum, but in a comparison of profit margins to other competitors. So Samsung considers it to be a failed business year if they're earning less money than Apple on the market, even if they have a positive profit margin, which means that shareholders consistently push for their company to be more profitable than the others on the market. This is less likely if they collude as opposed to trying to cut each other down. But lastly, even if we accept a lot of the collusion mechanisms from their side, there's internal competition. These companies own hundreds upon thousands of subsidiaries who compete with each other. Why is this the case? Because these corporations have to do insane amounts of market research, of screening, of innovation experimentation. It's hard to do in a centralized manner. So you outsource locally, and the mechanism which will incentivize this to happen is to have your own subsidiaries compete with each other. So there is still a mechanism, even if we ground the collusion thing on a broader level. But then this opening government says, it doesn't really matter, right? Because profitability stays the same. We don't think it stays the same because costs grow proportionally to the amount of capital companies have. Because when we talk about IP laws and lawsuits, when we talk about venues, when we talk about the royalties artists ask for, all of these costs increase when there is a knowledge on the market that the companies are able to pay for these costs. So it ends up washing out. What is not comparative, what is comparative, however, the point where you have companies with less of a buffer, insofar as I explained that the music industry is incredibly speculative, they're consistently at risk of bankruptcy. They're consistently at risk of their business model failing. This makes them more risk averse. They produce less artists, not more. Why then on our side of the house is it better for artists and do we produce more artists? First of all, we can pay artists more money. With money, people survive. If they survive, they produce more music. Secondly, however, all of these things I've already explained are incredibly expensive. Stuff like equipment, stuff like studios, organizing concert venues, organizing festivals, organizing tours. We're able to provide more artists with more concerts, festivals, and tours because we have economies of scale to do that, but also because we're able to centralize multiple artists within one hub as opposed to have them spread out. We're able to have such festivals and such tours where artists collaborate with each other and each get to share in each other's popularity, which provides all of them with a larger platform. Thirdly, though, it's easier to market new talent because you already have the setup mechanism, you already have the expertise and the reach for advertising. Even if people don't know these artists, they know your brand as a company. This is comparatively lower on their side of the house when the companies do not have a time-tested brand, which means we're better able to market new talent. And you want to market new talent because of the speculativity of the music industry I've described earlier, because you never know how trends are going to develop. You never know which part of the world the new artist is going to come from. This means you want to branch out in terms of your market share. This means you want to discover new talents globally. This means you want to experiment with new genres. The comparative is then when you have more capital to do that, when you have a larger market share because you're one large company as opposed to multiple smaller companies, you simply have a larger capacity to do that. This ultimately then means that A, more artists get access to quality in terms of the conditions that they have to produce their art, in terms of other artists they collaborate with, and in terms of the resources that they have. But secondly, it means we get more music and more diverse music on our side of the house. And this is crucial because the comparative of the average person's access to music actually is not a comparative. Because we all know that we live in the age of fucking piracy. You can get songs for free. You can just crack Spotify or crack Deezer and get that for free. That's completely uncomparative. The only comparative is when you do crack Spotify, how many songs are on there. Insofar as we prove that we get more of that, and it's literally the only positive coming from open government, we already win. I'm also going to preempt a potential argument coming from the other Jack about accountability of these companies and the conditions for those artists. But before I do that, Jack Williams.
So opening opposition say that you have a bunch of subsidiaries that compete, which is just the go. But on their side, you can't advertise 3 new artists at once because you would fuck over each of them. Where on our side, 3 independent art firms can do so, and you get all of those benefits.
Well, first of all, that is uncomparative. Because if your assumption is that there is a zero-sum game of advertising one artist as opposed to the other, this is zero-sum in terms of how many people listen to them, regardless of who the advertising actors are. But secondly, the weird assumption behind the POI is that all music is the same genre, that all people live in the same parts of the world, that all artists are of the same identity and gender. There are different reasons why people identify with different types of music, and insofar that's true, I'm not sure why promoting Metallica simultaneously fucks over Serbian folk music. This seems to be a very weird point to me in this debate. But lastly, on accountability, if they want to run abuse very bad for artists and stuff like this is probably not going to happen. One, social accountability. We live in the era of cancel culture. People are socialized into this. Secondly, the artists themselves have a following. We have the Swifties and people like this with parasocial relationships to those artists. You do not want the artists coming out and talking about what your company did. You do not want to have another Britney Spears. You do not want to have another Kevin Spacey. But lastly, the shareholder thing is also an accountability mechanism because the value of the shares drops at the point where the company is involved in a scandal. So, accountability is not comparative. Quality of music and quantity of artists is comparative. For those reasons, opening opposition.
begin by discussing collusion. Because Tim stands up and says, they don't collude on the competition for artists. CF, I don't know why. Just broadly because people want to establish themselves, have speculative and things like this, but Jack's mechanisms still do ultimately apply to this and not engage the logic of Jack's arguments. But I want to make two observations on this. Firstly, this does explicitly apply to the conditions for artists, because sure, everyone wants to have the next big thing, but ultimately, if the next big thing gets a 80% share in their revenue rather than a 50% share, you could have had the second biggest thing and still made more money overall as a corporation. And you all know this each other, and you all know you're not relatively smart, you're relatively stable actors who've been in this market for a very long time. Which means overall, you don't want to offer brilliant conditions. You don't want to offer brilliant payouts. You should compete for artists, sure, in looking for people, but you don't offer competitive wages and shares and things like this. Another reason for this as well, and deeper, this is important characterization for later on in the speech, is that you can manufacture the next big thing exclusively on their side. We've all heard Apple, that's why, like the song, that's why Tin now to know what it means to be brat. But the fact is, Apple has only blown up because of Charlie XCX's studio, making other people in the studio and people doing paid promotions to all do the same fucking TikTok dance, and now we all have to listen to it. It's a good song, thankfully, this time. A lot of the other ones weren't, and frankly, that wasn't very brat of that studio. It means we're in a situation now where certain songs happen to be manufactured into the next big thing, rather than needing to search for the next big thing. So the premise, the unmechanized characterization that it relies upon is inherently false. But secondly, the reason why you don't search out for loads and loads of new stars all the time is it affects your own current star's marketability. It's actually very hard to have a certain artist who fulfills a certain niche. So if you were the label that was involved with Taylor Swift, you then don't want to be another classic relatable girls, folksy, speaking truth to the patriarchy kinds of things, because that is her brand image. So you may actually affect one of your core stars' earnings if you then go against it. This is not just bad because, well, you don't want to affect your core stars' earnings, but also some big stars may go within the corporation and get a share in it eventually, if they eventually get enough leverage. So they themselves have an incentive to not make their own labels recruit a bunch of other artists. This is just not true. The way in which Tim, sit down, engages with our collusion stuff, right, are iterative game theories. So literally, you all watch the recording and you're all here. Jack Williams says the way competition works is you undercut because then in the future, you make more profits. But that's a single edition of the game. That's the classic business dilemma. The fact is that the game repeats. You know other people then undercut you. Tim's response is, but this is risky because other people may undercut you. But it's an iterative game theory, and you know you're all involved in the same game, where the most game theoretically strategic thing to do is to not lower prices. And the factors panel, and ladies and gentlemen, we all fucking know this, because we all see the prices of things. We all see the deals that artists are getting. Their prices are going up, the deals are getting worse. The fact here is that everyone knows within this industry how the functioning of it works. Once you have an isolated group of actors, you have 3 different companies who you all know are not stupid, all have these same financial executives or highly trained financial executives. They are all aware of the same game theory that we present to you in opening government. And the fact is then that they don't need to collude. There's no antitrust or fucking bullshit, we're going to regulate this because you can't talk to each other. You don't need to talk to each other. You just know what to do because you're not stupid and you have smart financial planning onto the long run. The way which they try to get around this is, but shareholders actually care more about competition and having a higher market share than they do about profits. What? Literally what? Shareholders get money from dividends, which is based on profits. You care most about profits as a shareholder. You can't just say these things. The motivation to redeem shareholders in and of themselves is the idea of the profits in and of itself, and that is a long run. I'm going to take the POI because I'm going to say that up in perfect response.
Shareholders are also dependent on the value of the share.
Yeah, so it is, so market share, yeah. So, the reason why this is not true is ultimately the idea that, in fact, a lot of the people who invest in large, huge corporations are large institutional investors, which are not people who are relying on, you shouldn't shake until I finish the sentence, it's really bad for you, is people who are not reliant on the share, the value of the share in itself. Because institutional investors, or deep value investors, are people who get their profits on the dividends because they don't plan on ever really selling that share. So share value go up, sure, that's cool, but why do you care? You're holding onto the share for the fact of the dividends because you are a long-term investor. That's why people invest in things like Apple all the time, whereas some other people invest in speculative industries. But this is not a speculative industry. The investors in these companies are in for the long run, so you care more about dividends than the actual value of the share in itself. That's why the POI did not work. So overall, I think we have conclusively proven that there is a huge problem with collusion. This means artists get worse deals. It means the market overall is conglomerated in a way which other people can't break in. But on that itself, I want to talk about costs a little bit and then talk about new talent. On costs, Tim made a very damning concession. When the way they respond to our cost idea is that, aha, well, people know you can pay more, so like venues and stuff decide that you should pay more. Why is this so detrimental? Because ultimately, panel, if it is the fact that the venues or like streaming platforms and stuff know that they can charge more because the labels are earning more money, what's the problem here? 3 labels were earning more money. 3 labels had the capacity stuff which they talked about. They were able to pay these higher costs which venues demanded, which meant those smaller labels, without that same capacity to compete with these large ones who are conglomerated, were then shut out from these venues, were shut out from the notability that that gives their artists. And that's why the amount of different genres and different artists we see shrunk. It's why these smaller labels died, because they weren't able to compete with the new expectation of costs that larger labels could pay when they conglomerated. Which is to say, you have a huge loss of the spread of smaller labels as they died out because they weren't able to keep up with these venue costs. They weren't able to keep up with these production costs because these expectations did change. Sure, you were right, but you probably shouldn't have said it. Lastly then, on new talent. Look, the idea here is like you're speculative and so on, to certain capacity. I've already dealt with some stuff on like who wants to get new talent to the top, as I mentioned, like why that characterization was important. But separately, on the capacity, we preserve a sufficiently spread capacity. If these smaller labels haven't died, they're all spread over different catchment areas, different regions of countries, or it's based on different kinds of genres that they're constantly searching for, and they are still in a position to still find those new artists to a large degree. Not because they might be specialized into it, they'll be quite good at it. Tim says like, aha, but you like go to your subsidiaries, but sure, like the subsidiaries just stay independent on our side. I don't know why they needed to become a subsidiary. In fact, the ones that didn't get to become subsidiaries died out, so we have a larger spread of smaller labels finding new artists. The thing that they overall then say is on the impact. You have more diverse artists, more diverse music, but this is not true. 2 Swedish fuckheads wrote like 90% of hit songs between 2011 and 2015. Because they were the ones that the big corporations hired. And because these big corporations could push a certain kind of sound in their huge advertising advantage that they got over smaller labels. And what this meant then is that rather than people going out and searching for music, because there's a bunch of different advertisers, you don't know what to listen to, certain big, huge artists became what you have to listen to. The way we engage with music became passive, and that's why you now see top 10 be far more homogenous than it was before. So diversity of music stuff is also just deeply untrue. We clearly win. Thank you.
Now, I'm the last person who should speak about music. I don't even listen to it, and I couldn't understand any of the references. I will ask them what brat is at the end. I have no idea. I thought that was like an annoying kid, but apparently it is not. But unfortunately for the jacks here, I do know a few things about collusion, so that's the first thing we're going to talk about, because that's 70% of this music debate. Luck for me. So first they tell you, okay, these people, they know each other, they go to events, they can talk. Then later they see, they don't even have to talk. They just like, they know the market, they have the experts and so on. Let's take that best case scenario that they are like so in tune to the market that they can simply vibe check all their way through monopolies, although we are talking about 3 different companies like in different countries with like a lot of different stuff happening. Like Tim gives you good reasons, which I don't think they address adequately about like how undercutting it is, but also notice that there is also a prisoner dilemma there, that you feel that the other side could undercut, especially if you guys see that they don't even talk to each other. So you don't know what they are going to do next quarter, you don't know what they're going to be pressured to do and so on. But really, like, let's take into account that we are talking about like 3 different companies, and not small ones, with a lot of people involved there, a lot of people in the upper management, a lot of people that are regulating that sort of stuff. And yes, regulations do exist for a reason. Yes, there are laws against these sort of things, and they do serve as a strong deterrent. If you guys want to say that they are talking to each other, then there is a strong deterrent that they could be fined, that they could lose their jobs and so on. So would they be willing to later? But look, that's not the main way we counter this. Note that there are other kinds of pressure. Because, and this is important, if you treat your artists poorly, notice that they don't even have to go to another part of the big 3. A lot of, especially the more popular ones, and those are especially important because those are the ones that are going to do the most money, they can do it solo, they can create their own companies, they have the influence, they have the connection. So you do fear on losing out to them. So you do want to keep them happy. And like, intuitively, do you guys believe that the top artists of today are like these like wage slaves, or just like us eating these like Scottish soups with 5 calories yesterday and hungry all the time? Or are they like eating a lot better? I think it's the latter. Come on. So no, I don't think that that they managed to prove collusion. I think they just want to get you into the vibe of hating companies. I hate companies as well, but I need to prove that. Okay, let's see what else they say. The positive part of their case, look, we're gonna get like more artists, so on. This is better for artists. They say you're not gonna want to promote new artists because you don't want to affect your current like artists in the same niche. Look, like already mentioned, I know nothing of music, but I do believe that you can have like Taylor Swift, and what is similar to Taylor Swift? I don't know. Miles listens to this. Yeah, that's carpenter. It's not a job. Okay, doesn't matter. So carpenter, I'm sure that there could be multiple of them in the niche, and you want to capitalize. If you have a young, talented person, of course you're gonna want to capitalize on that. Secondly, like notice that these people switch niches as well, so you don't know what is the next big thing. You want to diversify. You don't want to have all your eggs in one basket, so you're definitely gonna want more people coming in. It means more money and so on. Thirdly, notice that you're not necessarily gonna cut into the market share of your own guys. You could cut into the market share of the other part of the big three. You could cut into the market share of the smaller companies and so on. Okay, then they tell you, oh look, now alternatively everything would be spread out. So to answer 10 subsidiaries, they say, so it's like subsidiaries, it would be the same. I don't see like what is the difference. On this side now we have many different subsidiaries that cater to the different like markets where they have subsidiaries. I am certain in Croatia, they have ones here in the UK and so on. They're catering to the local market. What is this exactly big difference? How do we prove it? Look, our case is very intuitive. We have certain benefits that are for sure going to happen when you have these conglomerates working together. That is going to mean that they're going to get artists to collaborate. That is going to give spotlight to smaller artists, newer ones, because they have an interest in doing that. There are economies of scale, which is an economically proven argument that Tim here points out, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to give you guys a POI because you're like,
So the problem is, of this top app, is that we've watched them, they've watched us. So let's look at the conclusion. We have 20 recording studios that do all the things you want, and you have 3 of them doing all the things we agree on. So by that logic, we've won.
if that is like how you judge, I don't know. I'm kidding. Okay, look. Notice. So yeah, a part of this debate is a wash, but notice that the benefits that we have cannot be achieved with them having like 20 or like 100 or whatever. Meaning that you have a lot of people coming in your recording studio that you can get to work together, that you can market them more effectively, like that you simply have the more financial resources to do that sort of thing, that you can get them faster to the audience, which means that the audience can enjoy it a lot better. So there are benefits to having less of this, so I don't think you managed to prove that. I think that when taking the stuff that was previously mentioned about yes having subsidiaries, about yes having the ability to cater to this market because this is that sort of industry, it is not producing electricity, it has to cater to different markets in order for it to be effective. You really do have a situation where we get the benefit and we get some more. I don't know, this is a fun debate, go.
Yeah, so I mean like, we've watched them, right? But let's be real on the deputies here. The idea that a bunch of smaller labels die when prices go up overall, that hasn't been watched. So like, let's forget about those two.
Yeah, let's ignore them. I agree. I'm fine with that. Okay, yeah, sure. Okay, some of them die, but notice that first, like companies die like all the time. Meaning that, and with this, like at least on our side, when you have this sort of stability, it adds stability both to the artists and both to the people working for that thing. On your side, you have companies all the time dying, new ones getting created and so on. This is awful. It is awful for the people working there because they are the ones like losing their jobs, they are the ones facing insecurity, but it's also awful for the artists because you could spend years working with a label only for it to die for like whatever reason, and then you have a much worse position. You are losing your context, you are losing all of that. Meaning that on the part of what is better for artists and their stability, there is also that. But also for consumers. For consumers, it's better to have like stability, to have like subscriptions, to have all this, to know what they are getting, than to have like constantly 20 brandings that you need to remember. But, oh no, 5 of them died this year, what's new and so on. So for consumers, our side. For artists, more stability, all of that, the Tim Smart analysis, our side. For like all of that overall, for consumers, artists, I don't know what was the third thing, I think it's also our side. So taking all of that into account, and I would say that Balkan wins this, but I will say that it was pretty fun. So yeah, awesome guys.